Hello, and thank you for being here. My name is Steve Catalano, and I'm Senior Acquisitions Editor for Business and Economics here at Stanford University Press. On behalf of the press, we're honored to have with us today our distinguished authors, Arnoud Meyer and Peter Williamson, to discuss their new book, Ecosystem Edge, Sustaining Competitiveness in the Face of Disruption, which is just published and available for order now. New technologies, rapidly changing customer needs, and challenger competitors are disrupting standard business models. The book explains why building and leading a dynamic ecosystem of partners that reinforce, strengthen, and help a company to innovate is now an important way to meet these challenges. This book covers a strategy to accomplish this through current cases, clear tools, and specific takeaways that convert ideas into action. Let's meet our authors. Arnoud Meyer is University Professor at Lee Kong Chiang School of Business at Singapore Management University. He is the co-author of Process Theory, The Principles of Operations Management, and Global Future, The Next Challenge of Asian Business. Peter J. Williamson is Professor of International Management at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School and is Fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge. He is the co-author of The Competitive Advantage of Emerging Country Multinationals and Dragons at Your Door, How Chinese Cost Innovation is Disrupting the Rules of Global Competition. A brief technical note, please use the Q&A function on Zoom for questions when we get to our Q&A portion of this, and not chat. Thank you. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to be with you.
In your first conversations about business cases, you connected over the idea that innovation was happening in a new and different way, leveraging business networks. What did you see taking place?
Yes, well, we started to look at companies around Cambridge and how they were doing innovation, and we found it didn't seem to be happening just inside one company. Rather, it seemed to be happening with a network of partners and even competitors, something more like a biological ecosystem. So we were intrigued by this, and we started to talk about it with the executives we were working with. And interestingly, we found they were very receptive, and also that they said they'd actually started to do some of this, but they didn't know they were doing an ecosystem. So we decided to think about how do you be more strategic about adopting this kind of ecosystem thinking. And from there, we start the long journey to try and understand how business leaders could develop an ecosystem around their companies to make them more successful, and how they could lead and shape that ecosystem.
Actually, we understood quite quickly that the lead company in such an ecosystem couldn't fully control and direct its ecosystem, but they could sort of catalyze it, nudge it, lead it. And this led us to formulate originally 6 keys to unlock the ecosystem advantage. First of all, it was very important to pinpoint the value added that the partners can bring in the ecosystem. Secondly, you need to make sure that the different partners understand their role and that their roles are structured. Obviously, you need to make sure that the partners actually make complementary investments and that they help actually in the innovation in the system. And of course, if you work with partners, there are going to be transaction costs, and you have to try to make them as low as possible. Finally, you need also to make sure that there is co-learning, that you actually share the learning in the ecosystem. And finally, you must make sure that everybody can capture some value out of that ecosystem. And as Peter pointed out, early on, we had to explain the concept of ecosystems. But quite quickly, executives were actually quite convinced that it could be useful from them. And sort of we discovered that from, let's say, about 2015 onwards, they actually told us that they were convinced of the value of ecosystems, but didn't know how to develop and grow them. And that's actually the genesis of the book.
Disruption is the environment for many industries right now, and this has taken on dramatic new meaning in 2020. COVID-19 has brought massive impact to supply chains, access to customers, and workforce availability. But going forward, might there also be some opportunities? How can ecosystem strategies both deal with disruption and help companies grasp these opportunities in a crisis environment?
Yeah. So I think ecosystem strategies are really great for dealing with disruption because they allow a company to tap into capabilities and knowledge that's way beyond what any firm has inside itself at the moment. And I was struck by something that Germany's president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, said the other day when talking about coronavirus. He said, no single entity covers the medical, economic, and political elements required to produce a vaccine for all. And I think that's what the book's about. It's about going beyond the capabilities and knowledge in your company to harness things that will help you innovate in fundamentally new ways. And I think that's true whatever you're doing, whether you're trying to keep your supply chain moving or innovating or pivoting to a new business model. You're going to need capabilities and innovative responses that go outside your company. I mean, imagine what it takes for an auto company to move from cars to mobility. It's impossible for an auto company to do that on its own. So I think we need to think about what new capabilities you'll need from partners to restructure your business in the new normal that is going to follow, hopefully, the end of this coronavirus pandemic reasonably soon. And what new know-how and capabilities do you need to come up with new customer solutions? So that's where ecosystems really excel, in looking for a new solution that requires new capabilities and things from different sources, maybe from other industries, maybe from other countries, that come together and allow you to innovate in the future.
Yeah, actually what the current crisis illustrates is the need to be able to respond very quickly, find innovative solutions, and actually, most important of all, perhaps, scale them up very quickly. A vertically integrated firm or an existing supply chain can usually not cope with such demands. But an ecosystem, as Peter pointed out, a network of partners that co-evolve and align their investments can do so.
Changing landscapes in business, no longer just from emerging competition, or new forms of technology, but demand radical transformation. Who or what companies do you see harnessing ecosystems to deal with disruption, and how are they doing this?
Well, I think the first thing they've learned is, building on something Arnoud just mentioned, is that in this world of disruption, speed is critical. And companies used to think about being first to market, but I think today you have to think about being first to scale up an innovative idea, so speed to scale. And those benefits of scale are increasingly not only about your company, but about the scale the whole ecosystem achieves. I think one interesting example we saw was Thomson Reuters, and now Refinitiv, in the commodity markets, and they found that because of the disruption, their old models that were sort of projecting the past weren't working. So what they did, interestingly, is they put a mobile app in the hands of farmers to allow them to upload their data on what was happening on the farm. They got a benefit back by getting some of the aggregate information about that. But Thomson Reuters then allowed its people to use that data to come up with new forecasts of crops and volumes and prices, and then they sold that as part of a new suite of services. So they're expanding out beyond the normal group of people that they got the data from, and redoing their business model to deal with an environment that wasn't going to be forecast by just projecting the past. We also saw another company, people in the US will probably know, called Athena Health, and they created something called More Disruption Please to attract new partners with novel capabilities. And that helped them deal with disruption, but they also create a lot of data from that, which they then use to fuel an incubator and accelerator around this to bring in new startups. So the whole idea of dealing with disruption by expanding the group of people that you're relying on to come up with new innovations.
Yeah, that scaling up is actually very important. Two other cases that we have in the book is about Alibaba in China and the creation of Alipay, or Amazon Web Services, two companies that actually have dominant market share in their markets and have been able to scale up very quickly. And there is an interesting example here in Singapore, and you may not know it, those who are participating, but actually I'm sitting currently in Singapore. When Rolls-Royce, the producer of aero engines, wanted to set up a factory here in Singapore, they came to the conclusion that to have that factory, they needed a flow, actually a stock and a flow of about 2,000 skilled workers who could work in the production of airplane engines. And the closest airplane engine here in Singapore is in Japan, 6,000 kilometers away. So you couldn't really tap in an existing workforce, and they had to build up that workforce very rapidly and ensure, as I said, that it was not only a stock of 2,000 workers, some of them there will be a turnover and etc. So you need actually to have a flow of people. That they couldn't do alone. They required really collaboration with an ecosystem of the schools here, of the polytechnics, of the universities, the local workshops, the economic development board, the unions, etc. And they could do it in a very short period of time of 18 months because they could build up that ecosystem of people that could actually train that skilled workforce.
Thank you. We'd like to take a moment to address a few questions that have come in. The first one is looking forward, dealing with ecosystems in a post-COVID environment. What is the most significant decision organizations must be looking forward, taken looking forward to the life after this crisis for their businesses?
My immediate reaction to that would be that this is not only an economic crisis. If it would be purely an economic crisis, we could decide whether it's a V-shaped or an L-shaped or a U-shaped crisis, and I would leave it to the macroeconomists to solve that, to predict that, and to put in the right measures. The real problem with this crisis is that we're going to get out of it with very different customer behavior. The fact that we do this webinar already is an indication of that. And that our business models will have to be very rapidly adapted and adjusted. And I personally think, and I see this here in Singapore already happening, that the innovations that I expected to happen in terms of digitalization over the next 5 to 7 years will happen in the next 18 months. I had this morning a discussion with a law firm where the law firm basically, they all have to work from home. They've come to the conclusion that productivity has gone down by 20% because they work from home, and they need to, but have decided that until the end of the year, they're not going to go back to the office. In other words, they have to incredibly fast increase the productivity of their back office. Again, they can't do it alone. They need an ecosystem to do so. So the most important point is you'll have to think about how are your business models changing, and how do I mobilize an ecosystem to quickly adapt to the new environment?
Yeah, there's no way that a single company can learn all the new things it needs to get a new business model up and running at the kind of speed Arnoud's been talking about. So that's where tapping into the partners that already know how to do stuff that you don't know is absolutely critical.
That leads to a follow-up question about the cases. One asks, wondering why IBM failed to make the ecosystem not like ARM. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things we studied in the case, because a lot of people think that when you lead and orchestrate an ecosystem, you must, because of being powerful, make a lot of money out of it. But actually, IBM built an amazing IBM personal computer ecosystem and never could make any money out of it. And the key reason is because it didn't have what we call a keystone. So something that it provided beyond just orchestrating the ecosystem that everyone needed, a piece of IP, a key component. It didn't have that, and it didn't have a way to put a toll gate around that to collect a toll to become profitable. So of course, it turned out Microsoft and Intel had the keystones, and they made all the money. So I think it's an important lesson that it's not just enough to orchestrate and lead the ecosystem. You also need to have something that the ecosystem really needs that you can contribute, and that's what allows you to earn a return out of the ecosystem.
Great, thank you. Let's continue with our dialogue. How do you see ecosystems applying to traditional industries? What strategies are working out there for them?
Good question, Steve, because sometimes when we use our examples, we sort of get into the situation that people think that strategies, that ecosystem strategies are actually for fast-growing startups. As Peter already mentioned, and as we described in the book, all companies work in an ecosystem. That is not an issue. Usually companies don't realize that they work in an ecosystem and don't leverage that ecosystem more than enough. But now that we are, as I just said, we're confronted with this very different normal for business after the crisis subsides, many of the traditional incumbents, the traditional companies in mature industries will need to rebuild their business models and adapt to that changing customer behavior. It will again require pooling of competencies that you definitely not have not in your company, and you may have to use a lot more technology than we did in January 2020. Ecosystems are actually the solution to mobilize these competencies rapidly, as Peter pointed out. In fact, I'm working now within a company in the leisure industry, in the hospitality industry, and you don't need to have a crystal ball to predict that that is an industry that is going to change a lot as a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. How do you provide health and safety and the guarantee that you can quickly be repatriated when you run resorts in exotic islands in the Pacific? Or how do you organize yourself as a cruise organizer so that passengers will be able to disembark when there is an outbreak of a disease? These are new questions that we can only answer rapidly, quickly, by working in networks and ecosystems.
And what do you see in the book for smaller companies that are looking to develop ecosystems?
Yes, well, you might assume that to lead an ecosystem, you have to be the biggest. But one of the key examples in our book is a company called ARM, Advanced Risk Machines. You all use its product because it's in 95% of mobile phones, even if you don't know that it is. And that company was sold to SoftBank for $32 billion in 2016, despite only having sales of 1.5 billion. And it started with just 12 engineers in a 14th century barn in Cambridge. So it definitely wasn't the biggest person in its industry that includes Intel and Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor and Apple. But what it was able to do is, by focusing on a particular part of the chip design and bringing knowledge from all of those big partners, it was actually able to lead that part of the ecosystem. And it became the de facto world standard for this by actually using the ecosystem to understand the future consumer needs and technological needs of all those devices. And so it was able to become enormously valuable from a small start. So it's not just a matter of being the biggest. It's a matter of putting yourself in a pivotal position in the ecosystem that is key to it creating value, and then using your partners to expand your knowledge and capability base to build your business model around that.
Just echoing what Peter said, the book is actually, to a large extent, for smaller companies. That may sound strange because the names we use, AWS, Alibaba, Thomson Reuters, now Refinitiv. These are big companies. But actually, almost all of our examples were small companies when they built their ecosystem. Alibaba, when it started really with its ecosystem in 2003, 2004, was actually a small startup. And also one of the other European cases that we use, Dassault Systems, which is the second biggest European software company specialized in product life cycle management systems. That company, when it started with its ecosystems, was actually an entrepreneurial startup. They're now big companies, but they started as small ventures. And one of the companies we actually described is The Guardian. It's I mean, I don't know whether you know it in the United States, but it's a relatively small newspaper in the United Kingdom. And actually it was a bit of a small newspaper, a niche newspaper from my perspective. But they have been turning around in face of the disruption with technology. They have been turning around themselves into one of the most popular news sites in the world. More popular and often more consulted than the BBC or the Wall Street Journal. So what they have been able to, in the face of the disruption, and that's the subtitle of our book, right? But in the face of disruption, they have been able to transform themselves. They're still a relatively small company. So I think there are huge opportunities for small organizations to build their own ecosystems.
Well, you said an important word there is transformation. Innovation and agility are core ideas that an ecosystem strategy looks to bring. The book emphasizes that you cannot control an ecosystem fully, but it can be leveraged. What's the distinction there, and what does this mean managers should be doing?
We've learned that the leaders in an ecosystem cannot really command and control their ecosystems. They can, as I said earlier on, nudge, incentivize, lead ecosystem partners to help them achieve their goals. But that's actually something that is characteristic for any situation where you are confronted with very high uncertainty and where you need diverse capabilities and know-how to be brought together, and where the new solution needs to be discovered through innovation and learning, as well as implemented through innovation and learning. Ecosystem strategies, from our perspective, enable you to retake the initiative in face of the disruptive forces by allowing your company to harness in a very flexible way the new and broader range of partner capabilities that are necessary to underpin an effective response.
So a lot of the book, Steve, is about how you actually do that, how you make all those nice things happen. And we distilled 7 things. I'll just mention a few of them. The first is, when you've got a big ecosystem, everyone wants to join you. But when you're starting out, it's hard to get the partners to be involved. And so the first thing you have to do is demonstrate that you really believe in the ecosystem and are prepared to invest. So that's about making some tangible commitments, sharing some data or sharing some tools or sharing your knowledge to actually show the partners you actually believe in this and that you're going to go forward with it. The second thing is to attract the right foundation customers, and customers have to be part of almost all of these ecosystems because they're key in determining what the new solution or business model looks like. And one of the mistakes we found is a lot of people think, well, I'll go to my biggest customers. But the problem is they're probably the people with the most invested in the status quo. So we found that you had to go to some of the challengers in the industry because they were the ones that wanted to invest with you to create a new business model. They had much more to gain from that. And the third thing is that you need to design and share a roadmap for the development of the ecosystem. So partners can align their investments with that roadmap and that innovation path. And of course, you can't have a perfect crystal ball, so your roadmap is going to change and be adapted. But I think we found the important thing is that it's stable enough to allow partners to invest against it. If you change it all the time, you will obsolete partners' investment and they won't back you.
Interesting enough, a fourth element is that actually you have to be very good at communicating the value of joining the ecosystem to potential partners. You need and it's actually a simple business proposition, but you need to have a compelling value proposition for why partners should join you in the ecosystem. Now, that can be anything from spreading the fixed costs of the development through to accelerating innovation, accelerating the scaling up, or being part of a new product or service wave that goes viral, right? Once you've done that, you also have to make sure that these partners find it easy to join. And a fifth element is then also that you have to shrink the barriers to joining. The obvious first step is to waive any joining fees, whether these are real fees or whether these are sort of non-monetary fees. We can discuss that, but it is important to reduce the joining fee. But you can actually go further in making it easy to join by sharing information and developing some kind of standardized interfaces. And that's what, for example, Amazon Web Services does, the standardization of the interfaces, and allows partners to easily join their ecosystem. And you can also make it easy for the partners to have connections between themselves. You should avoid that you are sort of like a spider in the middle of a spider web where everything has to go through you. You should also allow that there are connections between your partners. And sixth element, you need to restructure your organization to interface effectively with external partners. Actually, we've noticed in our cases that this often requires the establishment of a dedicated partnership team, staffed with people who are able to make new types of decisions, such as which knowledge should be shared to promote the health of the ecosystem, what has to be kept proprietary to maintain your power, and as Peter pointed out earlier, you need always to make sure that you have your keystone that allows you to monetize actually your contribution to the ecosystem.
So just picking up on that final,
monetization.
just picking up on that final one, you know, you do all those great things. Of course, you've got to monetize the ecosystem. So as we were discussing earlier, that comes back to knowing what your keystone is, the thing that is your key contribution to the ecosystem, and putting some toll gates around that. And those toll gates could be license fees or royalties or transaction fees or selling value-added services around that, or the use of data that you collect from the ecosystem to create new profit streams. So as we said, that's absolutely key. IBM was not able to do it in the PC business, but all the other good things we talked about, of course, won't help the bottom line unless you also add that critical monetization ingredient.
Great, thank you. I have one more question for our interview, and then we'll head over to the Q&A. Again, we've had a few questions that come in. Just a reminder to our audience to use the Q&A link on our panel as opposed to the chat function. That would help us a lot in delivering your questions through. Looking forward, what do you see business leaders need, or what do business leaders need to keep in mind most about considering their strategies as new disruptions continue to appear on the horizon?
Well, I think you mentioned it in the word new. So if you want to do something fundamentally new, it's unlikely you're going to be able to do that just with the capabilities and knowledge inside your company. So that's why this is the time to look outside, to deal with this change, and as Arnoud said, to retake the initiative in this, in the face of disruption. So it's a way to flexibly harness that broader range of partner capabilities. And it sits somewhere between having it inside your company and a free market, because as Arnoud said, you can't control it, but you can shape it, you can nudge it. And so it's a way to get some of the benefits of having things in-house and some of the benefits of operating in a free market and putting those together. So bringing flexibility, and I should add an important thing that comes with that is that there's a sort of self-organizing element to these ecosystems. So your partners are doing things without you necessarily having to direct everything there, because they're in this for their own self-interest, and so they're adjusting to each other as well as to you.
Yeah, interesting enough, engaging partners in your ecosystem is a great way to harness their capacity for innovation, their capacity for learning, their capacity and their flexibility, and of course, as we said already several times, their specialized capabilities. But this only will happen if the ecosystem partners actually coordinate very clearly their investments, when they jointly innovate and obviously continually evolve, and they're going to do that only out of self-interest, not because inflexible contractual obligations. As Peter said, we have sort of this hybrid between what is a market and what is a hierarchy, if we put it in academic terms, but it's basically something in between contracts or command and control. And people will only fully participate in such an ecosystem if it fits their own self-interest. But the good news is also that if you can organize your business ecosystem well, like the Alibaba case that we described, or like the ARM case in risk processes, or the dominating market share that an AWS has been able to create in cloud computing, you can actually innovate more in an ecosystem because you have an access to a wider range of ideas, a wider range of experience and capabilities through all these partners that worked with you. You could never do it alone as fast and as good, or not even in a tightly prescribed alliance of one or two or three companies that work together. It's true that when ecosystem partners join the ecosystem, they continually contribute to diversity. They help fuel creativity, and as I said several times, speed up the pace of innovation. In a sense, what we say is that ecosystems make your organizations more agile. Some of that increased agility comes because of leveraging an ecosystem enables you, as I said, to harness the power of a large, dynamic, and partly self-organizing network of partners. It's sort of like a living organism, and that's the reason why we use that word ecosystem. The network continually evolves and adjusts to meet the changing needs of the market. Interesting enough, one of the biggest challenges for an ecosystem leader is leadership. Leadership of the management in that company, because you're going to have to motivate people in your partners. You will have to encourage, you have to, I don't want to use the word seduce, but it almost is like that. You have to convince them, often with build on the trust that you have built, your own expertise. You will have actually to exert leadership in other organizations. And you don't have direct command and control over these people. But what you need to do is to be so credible, having such an expertise, and have built up such a trust in the system that actually people will follow you as the ecosystem leader. It really requires a very different leadership style than the one that we see in most other organizations.
You could say it's really about getting people to do things who don't work for you. So yeah. That's a big change than what most managers are used to doing. So what we've tried to do in the book is not only show you why an ecosystem can help your business, but also how to implement a business ecosystem strategy. So as a business person, how do you kickstart that? How do you scale that? How do you stimulate innovation? How do you monetize it? So we hope people will find the book interesting in actually not only the concept, but also how to implement it.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions I want to make sure we get to before we sign off here. The first one pertains to one of the cases in the book, Rolls-Royce. The scaling of Rolls-Royce in Singapore would not have been possible without EDB playing explicit in the role of a catalyster. Is the presence of a catalyster a necessity to reach ecosystem scaling at this level?
Peter already spoke about a number of, and actually both of us spoke about a number of conditions to create and build up an ecosystem. One thing we didn't mention, but that we actually describe in the book, is that when you build up your ecosystem and you want to do it rapidly, that it's often good to look for partners that bring their own smaller sub-ecosystems. And that is actually the case for EDB and Rolls-Royce here in Singapore. Rolls-Royce could, of course, have tried to build its ecosystem with all the universities, all the polytechnics, all the institutes for technical education, the unions, could have done it themselves. But building that ecosystem probably would have taken them a lot of time, in particular because they may not have had all the relations here in Singapore to do so. Working with universities, working with the unions, but then also working with Singapore Airlines, by the way, but also working with EDB that brought that sort of sub-ecosystem of all its contacts within the government network, actually helped them to speed up the development of the ecosystem that delivers those skilled workers.
Great. Another question that came in. Digital industries are increasingly concentrated. What are the implications for the innovation ecosystem if one of the players is dominant, such as Apple or Google or Alibaba? Will innovation activity increase because the dominant player coordinates, decrease, or be biased in favor of that dominant player?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. So a couple of things to say about that. We found that the most successful ecosystems had lead or dominant companies who always thought about, how do I make the ecosystem more vibrant, more healthy, larger? So their first port of call was, how do I grow the size of the pie, not how do I slice up the pie? So you kind of need a benevolent person there who has the right way of thinking. As I said with ARM, sometimes even with dominant players, you can carve out a piece of the ecosystem, your own specialist ecosystem, which you can lead. And the other thing to say is that you probably also have to make a choice at some point, whether you try to lead the ecosystem or whether you become a contributor to someone else's ecosystem. Because, I mean, clearly, for these ecosystems to work, the partners in the ecosystem have to make money. So you can make money as a contributor. And one way we found to think about that is, if you're very dependent on one of these dominant players, it probably doesn't make sense or look realistic for you to become the ecosystem leader of the whole thing. You should focus, how do you actually become a contributor in that ecosystem? And you're going to have to make some compromises because the dominant players are going to lead. But the people that, as I said, have successful ecosystems, they first and foremost understand it's all about increasing the size of the pie and competing with people's ecosystems, so that they're not really biasing the innovation, and also enough flexibility for the partners to innovate and interact in the ecosystem, so not everything goes through the dominant company. And Arnoud mentioned a couple of times Amazon Web Services. I mean, the interesting thing about that is the innovation hasn't been in the platform. The innovation's been in the service providers, the consulting firms, the technical companies, the value-added software players around that, really added value of the platform to the final users. And to do that, you have to be willing to have the best interests of the ecosystem in mind and give enough flexibility for the partners to adjust and innovate without you trying to control everything.
Two quick examples, Steve. In the book, we describe how Alibaba told us that one of the most difficult decisions for them was not to do things and let the partners do it. Because there's always, if you're a big company, a tendency of saying, we could do it better. But then you actually stop innovation, the creativity, this whole group of smaller partners that actually come up with great creative ideas. In another example, a case that we wanted to write, but in the end decided not to write, was that of the Ford Motor Company when they wanted to start autonomous vehicle project, and where they declared publicly that they wanted to do it in an ecosystem. But when we wrote the case, we saw that very quickly the Ford Motor Company, as one would expect sometimes from a dominating company, starts buying up, starts absorbing, acquiring these smaller companies, integrating them within the larger companies. And actually they moved very quickly to a very traditional supply chain. Nothing wrong with that from the Ford Motor Company's position, perhaps, but it does actually it actually limits the innovation that can happen in an ecosystem. So the answer to the question is, dominating firms will probably stop innovation. Firms that know what is an ecosystem will stimulate innovation.
Well, that leads well into a follow-up question that came in pertaining to the smaller partners in an ecosystem. How do these partners protect their innovative ideas as they are being developed as a smaller partner in this larger ecosystem with larger dominant companies involved?
So everybody in the ecosystem has to ask a very important question about that, is what do I share with the ecosystem to help it become more successful? And what do I keep proprietary to make it possible for me to make some profit out of this and to protect my ongoing position in the ecosystem? So you have to have something that is differentiated, that you provide the ecosystem in order to give you power in that ecosystem. And you have to think about what to protect and what to share. So if we go back to the case of Arm, they get a lot of knowledge from their partners about the way the technology is going to develop in the future. They never share that with anybody in their ecosystem, because that is the key thing that allows them to develop the next generation of IP. But they share a lot of other things, including the interfaces and so forth in the ecosystem to make the ecosystem more successful. So I think one of the other issues that's important there is that your people in an ecosystem have to be comfortable with the idea that your partners are both partners you're cooperating with and competitors, because there's always a competitive element as people jostle for power in the ecosystem. So it's getting that balance right, making sure that you do enough to keep your role there protected, but also do enough to share things to make the ecosystem successful. Otherwise, if you look like a free rider, nobody's going to play the game with you. And we actually found that leading firms have to have a way to eject people who are not working to the common good of the ecosystem.
Yes. Yeah, we talk always about all the positive things of working in an ecosystem, but as Peter just said, you do sometimes have free riders, and you need to have actually ways of policing and getting rid of those free riders. Again, in the book we have a number of examples, but the one by Alibaba is an interesting one, where they really use panels of their partners to evaluate what some of the quote-unquote free riders would do and get them out of the system.
Great. One last question before we'll need to sign off. Do you think that this is kind of an organizational question? Do you think that ecosystem-based organizations perform better in times of crisis like COVID right now than traditional pipeline businesses?
Well, I think the big advantage they have is more flexibility. So they bring that flexibility, which is very hard to achieve inside an organization. So when we talk to executives about this, a lot of people say, well, actually, my internal organization should look like an ecosystem, but that's pretty difficult to achieve. So most organizations, like to do what they do and keep on doing it. So having the flexibility coming from this network of partners, I think is very beneficial in this kind of disruptive world that we're finding ourselves in.
One of the things that we do in the book in our last chapter is also indicating that we are not arguing that ecosystems are sort of a solution for everything. If you want to produce a standardized product in the most efficient way, please don't go for an ecosystem, because then a vertical integrated firm is probably still much more, or a good organized supply chain is much more effective. Ecosystems have disadvantages. That is, there are transaction costs. You can lower them, but there are transaction costs. There are some inefficiencies in it, but it is their speed of reaction in face of uncertainty, in face of crisis, as we have today, that actually gives them an advantage. So we don't say that ecosystems are a panacea that works under any circumstances. It is horses for courses, right? It is a solution to cope with uncertainty where you need to innovate and where you need to scale up very quickly.
So if you're in a beautifully, perfectly stable industry, you don't need to buy the book. But otherwise, we hope that the book will give you some real tangible and practical ideas how to actually stimulate and build and shape this ecosystem around you to deal with disruption.
Thank you. Important question that came in about the availability of this discussion today. The recording for this will be available on Stanford University Press's social media channels, and we are at Stanford Press on Twitter and Stanford University Press on Facebook. We would like to thank our authors, Arnoud and Peter, for their time today, and to all of the attendants for being with us. Ecosystem Edge, Sustaining Competitiveness in the Face of Disruption, is available now from Stanford University Press and major sellers everywhere. Please remember to use the code found on the invitation for today's event for a discount on the book. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.